The 23rd of September 1950, as dawn broke across the hills near Songju in North Korea, soldiers of the 1st Battalion Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders prepared for battle. The temperature in the mountains of North Korea was cool at dawn but would warm substantially as the sun rose through the morning hours. Adding to difficulties was the treacherous terrain, thick with stands of fir trees and loose rocks covering steep, precipitous slopes that made every movement a deliberate and exhausting test of nerve and endurance. The Argyll and Scottish Highlanders, men who had arrived in Pusan just weeks earlier on the 30th of August, 1950, to join the desperate defense of South Korea at the Naktong River defense line, were about to undertake an assault that military historians would later mark as one of the most peculiar and unforgettable engagements of the entire Korean War. In the rest of the video, I will be referring to our heroes as Argylls. The conflict would come to be known as the Forgotten War among many in the Western world. Now, you might be wondering why it is called so. Ladies and gentlemen, this is because the battle took place 5 years after the end of World War II, yet the details and its history got foreshadowed by the Great World War II. The battle we discuss in this video began as part of the Korean War, which itself had started just 90 days earlier on the 25th of June, 1950. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in a full-scale invasion designed to unify the peninsula under communist rule and total control, destroying or pushing back any resistance in their path. South Korea, caught unprepared and lacking heavy weapons and tanks and adequate military training and organization, had been driven back systematically towards the sea at Pusan in what many feared would be the first step toward their complete annihilation. By mid-July, UN forces realized that a major commitment would be necessary if South Korea was to be saved from communist domination. The United Nations responded with unprecedented speed, voting to send military forces to support the South with the intention of halting communist expansion in Asia. The 27th British Commonwealth Brigade, composed of British, Canadian, and Australian forces under Brigadier Code, had crossed the Naktong River on the 16th of September as part of a massive UN offensive designed to drive back the Korean People's Army. That is the North Korean Army. After successfully capturing and consolidating positions around Hyeonpong, the brigade pressed forward along a difficult second-class road toward higher ground that dominated the approach to Songju and the country beyond. Brigadier Code recognized that the high ground on either side of the road would have to be secured before any further advance could be made to ensure safety and security of his advancing troops. This was a tough operation because even the Americans were reluctant to provide artillery support for this dangerous advance. But Brigadier Code understood the fundamental importance of seizing high ground in mountainous terrain. The mountains of Korea were kingmakers. Whoever held the hilltops held the country and its control. The geography, as already mentioned, was unforgiving, the slopes steep, and the ridges commanding, while the political stakes were immense and fundamental to the entire war effort. The North Koreans understood their importance as well and had thus fortified these positions carefully, preparing defensive positions and weapons emplacements, particularly a feature called Hill 282, which lay directly in the path of the British advance and commanded views of the surrounding valleys and ridges for miles in every direction. On the 22nd of September, the Middlesex Regiment attacked the hill on the right of the road, and after a sharp fight, claimed victory with surprisingly few casualties, establishing a foothold while advancing. Now, it fell to the Argylls to take Hill 282, the main objective on the left of the road, which due to its extreme height offered strategic view over the surrounding terrain for many miles in all directions. Colonel Nielsen, commanding the 1st Battalion Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, realized that daylight would not be sufficient for the attack. Thus, he obtained permission to delay the main assault until first light the following morning, giving his men time to properly reconnoiter the objective, rest as best they could manage under the circumstances, and prepare thoroughly for the coming fight ahead. That night, the soldiers lay in a state of uneasy sleep, as men do before a set peace battle, each one contemplating what daybreak would bring. The younger, less experienced men among them carried the heaviest burden of anticipation and apprehension and fear of the unknown that lay ahead. As civilians, this I understand would be very difficult for many of us to imagine, knowing that you are not guaranteed another day on this rock. Let that thought sink in, ladies and gentlemen. Anyways, the attack was scheduled for 5:15 hours on the 23rd of September, with B and C companies of the Argylls tasked with seizing the summit in a coordinated assault that would rely upon surprise, speed, and tactical skill. It was just before dawn that the watchful men of A Company heard the other two companies forming up in the dry riverbed below Hill 282 in the darkness. As the sky grew lighter and the first traces of dawn appeared over the eastern ridges, the leading platoons of B Company, commanded by Lieutenant Mackellar and Sergeant Paddy O'Sullivan, launched themselves up the hill through the dense and confusing vegetation. The scramble up the slope was difficult and disorienting, requiring men to pick a way through thickly planted fir trees and among loose rocks covering the slope, all while maintaining unit cohesion and tactical formation. Let us not forget that the soldiers had to maintain the element of surprise for the attack to be successful, and the terrain was making that almost impossible. After just under 1 hour of climbing through the difficult terrain in the early dawn light, the forward platoons of B and C companies reached the crest of Hill 282. Think about that moment for an instant. The Highlanders, after the steep climb in the darkness and growing dawn light, with their rifles ready, bayonets fixed and gleaming in the early morning sun, suddenly emerged into a small saddle or valley that lay atop the ridge. And there, to their astonishment, and to the astonishment of later historians studying the records, they encountered a large group of North Korean soldiers who were not preparing for combat, not standing to arms, not even alert and vigilant. They were eating breakfast. The North Korean platoon was sitting calmly in the small saddle between two rises on the hilltop, eating rice from baskets. All that noise and gunfire and sounds of combat that had been going on during the climb up through the trees, the shouts of men, the sounds of movement and equipment, the confusion and chaos of the assault, and yet the North Koreans had continued with their meal as though it was all normal. A foul smell of fish cooking for breakfast disturbed the Scotsmen, especially the veterans of Burma from earlier wars during the Second World War. Without doubt, the North Korean soldiers were completely taken by surprise by the assault from above. Pause and imagine being there at that moment. You are a young North Korean soldier, perhaps conscripted months earlier, against your will into the military apparatus of a totalitarian state. This has to be understood in the backdrop of historical records from North Korean defectors, which reveal that soldiers were fed inadequately on corn powder and rice mixed with sand, their nutrition barely sufficient to sustain their bodies through days of labor and training. Training ammunition was so scarce that soldiers were given only 3 bullets each for lev, fire drills, a pittance compared to the modern militaries. you were told repeatedly. Rather, the idea was drilled into your brains that your duty was to sacrifice yourself for the supreme leader. You sit with your unit eating rice from a basket, perhaps one of the few moments of relative calm and peace in a day of movement and vigilance and constant awareness of threat from enemy forces. You have endured hunger and deprivation as part of your military service. Then, suddenly, without warning, figures emerge from the mist and trees above you, men in unfamiliar uniforms, running down the slope toward your position with weapons ready. There is no time to think, no time to organize a defense, no time to process what is happening. The shock is total and overwhelming, a moment of terror. The British soldiers, most of them young and energized by the assault up the steep hillside, charged forward with a fury born of adrenaline and military training and the momentum of attack. There was much confused firing as grenades, bayonets, rifle butts, and hobnailed boots of the Highlanders came into striking distance of the defenders. Both platoon commanders, Lieutenant Mackellar and Sergeant O'Sullivan, were wounded in the fierce melee that followed the initial charge. Yet, lying on the ground, their wounds preventing them from standing and moving freely, they cheered their men on with voices hoarse from pain and exertion. Led by Corporal Sweeney, the Argylls executed a proper Highland charge, a tactical movement and assault technique perfected over centuries of Scottish military tradition, and drove the North Koreans down the reverse slope of the hill in disorder and retreat. It was a sharp and successful engagement, a fierce fight at close quarters where bayonets and rifle butts were as effective as bullets. 15 enemy had already died immediately after the fighting stopped, while other North Korean runners, attempting to flee down the slope, were observed to be hit by fire, fall to the ground, and lie still on their way down the far slope. The Argylls lost 1 man and 6 were wounded in the initial assault and charge, but they had secured the critical crest of Hill 282 yet. The story of this engagement does not end there with that dramatic morning assault. As the morning advanced and the sun rose higher in the sky, it became clear that the North Koreans, despite their surprise at the hilltop and their initial defeat and retreat, were not defeated in any broader sense. Higher ground to the southwest, on Hill 388, which lay nearly a mile away, was still occupied by the North Korean 10th Division. The North Koreans on this higher feature could still observe every movement on Hill 282, and they quickly organized a response to recapture the position. Pursuant to that, the North Koreans began intense and accurate mortar bombardment, which unfortunately killed 4 more Argylls and wounded 9 others. The sense of victory after the first assault was slowly fading away as the situation deteriorated rapidly with daylight. The 7th Platoon of C Company, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant J.R.R. Eddington, which was positioned closest to the higher ground, faced the brunt of the enemy fire. In just half an hour, Eddington's platoon was reduced to 7 men able to fight. When we say able to fight, they were barely able to hold it together, but their sense of duty and courage were much more powerful than any weariness or injury they had. When reinforcements were sent up, those men too were riddled with casualties. Yet, they held on with remarkable tenacity and absolute determination not to yield ground. The order had been given that it would be held to the last man and the last round. So, Major Jim Gillies of C Company and Major Alastair Gordon Ingram of B Company remained at their posts and remained confident that the position would be held. Meanwhile, at approximately midday, with American artillery fire withdrawn and 5 supporting United States tanks unable to bring fire due to the terrain, the Argylls called urgently for an air strike on Hill 388, but This would soon prove to be disastrous. Just after noon, the sound of approaching aircraft reached the ears of the exhausted defenders. Three United States Air Force P-51 Mustangs of the 18th Fighter Bomber Wing circled Hill 282 where the British displayed their white recognition panels, confirming their status of being friendlies. To his dismay, Captain Radcliffe of the Tactical Air Control Party could not establish contact with the Mustangs because his radio was defective. It was later revealed that several British forward air controllers had not yet notified the pilots of proper air recognition panels or current positions. The Mustangs, confused by the panels displayed by both sides, made a catastrophic error at 12:15 p.m. The American fighter bombers dropped napalm bombs onto the Argylls position and strafed it with 50 caliber machine gun fire. The attack lasted only 2 minutes, but left in its wake 60 Argylls casualties. Major Kenneth Muir, second in command, had been leading an ammunition resupply and evacuation party to the crest before noon. When he saw the flames dying down and noticed that wounded men still held a small area on top of the hill, he quickly assembled about 30 men and led them back up the slope before North Koreans could reach the summit. There, 2 bursts of automatic fire struck him mortally. As he was being carried from the hilltop, his last words were that neither the Gooks, pointing to North Koreans, nor the U.S. Air Force will drive the Argylls off this hill. Major Muir later died of his wounds. For his actions that day, he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest decoration for valor. And the Argylls, keeping their promise to the Major's last order, continued the battle for Hill 282. Major Gordon Ingram, now commanding a fraction of his original force, counted only 10 men able to fight. His 3 Bren guns were nearly out of ammunition. At 3:00 p.m., after hours of desperate fighting, the survivors were forced to withdraw down the hill. The next day, a count showed the full cost. 2 officers and 11 men had been killed, 4 officers and 70 men wounded, and 2 men missing, for a total of 89 casualties. Approximately 60 of those had been the direct result of the mistaken air attack by U.S. Air Force. Yet, the Argylls had held Hill 282 despite the obvious dangers and despite being fired upon by their allies. They had driven off the North Korean forces and held the high ground. The image of those North Korean soldiers eating rice calmly amidst chaos and gunfire speaks to something profound about war itself. Perhaps it reflected discipline and a determination to maintain routine. Perhaps it reflected exhaustion so complete that men could do nothing else but eat when able. Perhaps it reflected a way of maintaining morale through ritual and normalcy. Or perhaps it reflected something simpler and more human, a moment of peace seized amidst war. The North Korean soldiers, like all soldiers in all wars, were men who did not realize that it could be their last breakfast. They came from villages and farms, from families who worried about them. Yet, in that moment at dawn on Hill 282 sitting with their rice, they were simply soldiers trying to sustain themselves before the next engagement. The Argylls were similar in many aspects too, being men far from home fighting in a war many in Britain barely understood. They had been trained in Hong Kong and thrown into combat against an enemy they had never seen before. That they captured Hill 282, held it against all odds, and endured the tragedy of friendly fire while maintaining discipline. The incident illuminates the chaos of war, where communications fail and men have to make split-second decisions with incomplete information. It reminds us that even well-trained professional armies are vulnerable to the confusion that characterizes actual combat. Let us not forget that United States had participated in the Second World War till about 5 years prior to the battle on Hill 282, so it was not a lack of experience. I don't mean to trivialize it, but that's war. The 27th Brigade's story didn't end there. Their advance continued beyond Hill 282. They pushed on toward Songju, driving north as the UN offensive sought to defeat the North Korean forces. They advanced to Sariwon on the 17th of October, crossed the Chongchon River on the 23rd of October, and continued north in the belief that the war was nearly won. But in late October, the unexpected happened when the Chinese forces entered the conflict, transforming the war and forcing UN forces into a bitter retreat that would last for months. The Korean War lasted from the 25th of June 1950 until the armistice was signed on the 27th of July 1953. It resulted in 3 million casualties. It divided the Korean peninsula, which still stands as a monument to the failure of military solutions to political problems. The 1st Battalion Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders endured the entire war. They served on Hill 282 and in countless other engagements across Korea. Their story remains largely untold. The image of North Korean soldiers eating rice at breakfast, calmly and casually, just minutes before they were overrun by charging Highlanders, endures as a poignant reminder that war is a human experience, one that encompasses moments of strange normalcy amidst overwhelming violence and danger. Ladies and gentlemen, I know this story had an unexpected twist that many of you would not have expected or preferred, but as I said earlier, that's war. It's the truth. There are many such stories that have gone untold, and with the project I call Archive of Wars, I would like to bring you the complete truth. Help us in that endeavor by liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel for more. I will see you in the next video with another forgotten story from the history of wars very soon.